Day 11. Robert Kennedy would one day write that on the 11th day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he felt that this cup was not going to pass, and that a direct military confrontation between the two great military powers was inevitable. Both hawks and doves sensed that our combination of limited force and diplomatic efforts had been unsuccessful. If the Russians continued to be adamant and continued to build up their missile strength, military force would be the only alternative. I'm Indy Neidell. This is TimeGhost, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yesterday, U.S. Ambassador to the UN Adlai Stevenson had faced off with his Soviet counterpart Valerian Zorin and made Zorin look foolish while proving to the world that the Soviets had in fact placed nuclear weapons on Cuba. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had decided to offer the U.S. a trade, guaranteed sovereignty of Cuba for removing his missiles. The so-called quarantine, a U.S. naval blockade of Cuba, was in effect, but there were no suspicious ships to stop as they had all turned back to Russia. This robbed the U.S. of the chance to show the world how the blockade would be enforced. Finally, the U.S. Navy decided to board a seemingly random non-Russian ship to perform a demonstration. On the morning of October 26, 1962, this ship, the Lebanese-flagged freighter Markula, manned by a Greek crew, which has taken on cargo in Riga and is on its way to Havana, is moored to a U.S. Navy destroyer in the waters east of Cuba. U.S. President John F. Kennedy is following the board and search operations via radio link from the White House. As expected, the ship has no contraband on board and is allowed to proceed. At the same time, Kennedy has just received the morning newspapers, and they're full of rumors of an imminent American invasion of Cuba. Considering that the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force have now amassed the greatest amount of men and equipment seen since the Korean War, both on and off the U.S. East Coast, this is a fairly reasonable assumption. The letter from Khrushchev, a long one, offering the trade has not yet arrived. Khrushchev has other problems on this crisp Moscow morning as well. His ally in Cuba, Fidel Castro, is getting very nervous. Yesterday evening, Castro held a passionate public speech in Havana promising to shoot down any Yankee spy planes that fly over the island. Now that's already not great for Khrushchev, but it gets even worse when he reads Castro's Armageddon letter. It says, "If the imperialists invade Cuba with the aim of occupying it, the dangers of their aggressive policy are so great that after such an invasion, the Soviet Union must never allow circumstances in which the imperialists could carry out a nuclear first strike against it. I tell you this because I believe that the imperialists' aggressiveness makes them extremely dangerous. However harsh and terrible the solution, there would be no other." In other words, in case of an invasion of Cuba, Castro wants the USSR to strike the U.S. with nuclear force before the U.S. themselves resorts to nuclear arms. Now, Khrushchev could, of course, just ignore this and simply not grant Castro's wish. If it wasn't for those tactical frog missiles on Cuba, which, if he wanted to, Castro could just seize and use for himself. Not only could he fire at invading troops, from a boat, he could get someone close enough to Florida to fire a couple at the U.S. mainland. Needless to say, that would force both Khrushchev and Kennedy's hands and launch a full-out nuclear war. While Khrushchev deals with Castro, a U.S. invasion of Cuba is not fake news. President Kennedy is once again considering it. Remember, he still has not received Khrushchev's proposal. The topic of the day is what to do next, since the blockade itself will not eliminate the nukes. Now, at the beginning of this XCOM meeting, there are two remarkable things that are covered. This happens before the president starts recording, and in portions of the recording that have been excised and are still classified. But it's easy to piece together what's going on by looking at the references to those parts during the rest of the discussion and through other declassified documents. First of all, it's now known and confirmed that the U.S. knows about the tactical frog missiles. They were photographed and identified on October 25th in one of the low-altitude flybys. This does not stop discussion of an invasion. Instead, U.S. forces with tactical nukes of their own are being made ready to take part in an invasion. Second, Director McCone of the CIA now distances himself from a CIA operation to send small groups of Cuban exiles as sabotage crews to Cuba to take out the missiles and assassinate Castro. Remember that on day one, we mentioned that Attorney General Robert Kennedy had been made the unofficial chairman of Operation Mongoose, the secret sabotage operation to disrupt Cuba and possibly eliminate Castro. Well, it turns out that ever since the first day of the crisis, McCone and Bobby Kennedy have been adapting these plans as an alternative to invasion to end the crisis. Now McCone doesn't want to proceed for fear of failing and getting the blame for another CIA-led debacle like the Bay of Pigs invasion. So, on the advice of National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, it becomes part of the post-invasion plans instead.
President, my suggestion is that we should reconstitute Mongoose as a subcommittee of this committee in the appropriate way, and I think we can work that out this
I think that's good, because it's matter you called me about last night. You see, which is what kind of a government can have it all part of the Mongoose.
Yes, I called Mr. McCone last night, and I called Mr. Martin, and I thought we ought to be making a crash program on the problem becomes in one of its days, what kind of people, how many Cubans we'll have, what will be the civil government arrangement. These are very important matters. Well, now, who will take on that?
McCone informs them that the meeting to set that up is already underway. So, this is how serious they are about an invasion. They're already planning how to take political and administrative control of Cuba afterwards. Another piece of important intelligence they received is that the work to make the Soviet missiles launch ready is continuing. In fact, many years later, it will come to light that at this point, a mobile unit of 2 SS-4 missiles is already deployable and set up only a few kilometers away from Guantanamo, the U.S. military base on Cuba. The XCOM members have concluded that even if the blockade is stopping new arms from coming in, it's not doing anything to get rid of the ones there. With more and more missiles getting ready, there's now a sense of urgency. In the next meeting, they start looking at their options to solve that problem. After the UN session and meetings with UN General Secretary U Thant yesterday in New York, Adlai Stevenson and Presidential Advisor John J. McCloy have now traveled to Washington and are also part of the XCOM meeting. Both of them are in favor of negotiating with the Soviets through U Thant, possibly even lifting the blockade before those negotiations start. McCone is not impressed.
But I want to conclude by making it very clear. The intention here was a standstill, not positive acts. And the standstill was to include the discontinuance of construction, discontinuance of shipping, discontinuance of the quarantine for 48 which we'd have to agree how to do that in 48 hours. After that, we'd negotiate a final settlement which would relate to the withdrawal of weapons or the inoperability of weapons already inoperable. I would think inoperable becomes meaningless because during the long-term negotiations we're concerned with the withdrawal of weapons.
I don't agree with that, Mr. President. I feel very strongly about it, but I think that the real crux of this matter is the fact that he's got these pointed, for all you know, right now at our hearts, and this is going to produce, I think it may produce a situation when we get to Berlin after the elections that changes the entire balance of the world power, puts us under a very great handicap to carry out our obligations to our, not only to our Western European allies, but to the hemisphere. And I think that we've got the momentum now. We've got the feeling that these things are serious and that they must be, that threat must be removed before we can drop the quarantine. If we drop that quarantine once, we're never going to be able to put it in effect again. And I feel that we must say that the quarantine goes on until we are satisfied that these are inoperable.
Well, now the quarantine itself won't remove the weapons. So you're going to get two ways of removing the weapons. One is to negotiate them out, in other words, trade them out, and the other is to go in and take them out. I don't see any other way you're going to get the weapons out.
While these deliberations go on, Others are suffering the consequences of the decisions made by the leaders on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The U.S. Navy is now hard on the heels of the 4 Soviet submarines. They chase them from one location to the other, hitting them with signaling depth charges to try to get them to surface. The chase is so intense that the subs cannot surface for fresh air or to reload their batteries. The conditions on board are absolutely horrifying. One of the seamen writes in his diary, dedicated to his wife,
"We are in the enemy's lair, and we can't reveal our presence to them, but they sense our nearness and are searching for us. They detected us yesterday, but we managed to escape. Something exploded somewhere, but at a distance from us, so we don't know how serious it was. But here, inside the sub, the situation is very serious. The men are feeling notably worse. A lot of them are ill. People are fainting. Many have swollen feet. No one can sleep in this monstrous heat and stuffy air, even though everyone is very tired and weak. The worst thing is that the commander's nerves are shot to hell. He's yelling at everyone and torturing himself. He's already becoming paranoid, scared of his own shadow. For 4 days, we haven't been able to get a breath of fresh air, to emerge at least with periscope death. It's getting hard to breathe in here, too much CO2.
Today, 2 of the submarines run out of electricity and have to surface. Now they are allowed to recharge and are escorted back towards Russia. The other 2, the B-36 and B-59, are still submerged and evading the U.S. Navy. By now, they have lost all contact with the outer world, most significantly with Central Command in Moscow. In such a scenario, they have orders to determine themselves whether to deploy their tactical nukes. In Washington, D.C., XCOM is meeting again.
There's no action that, other than diplomatic, that we can take, which does not immediately get rid of these. There's only 2 ways to get rid of them, as I said this morning. One is the diplomatic way, which I don't think is going to be successful. The other way is, I would think, a combination of an airstrike and probably invasion, which means that we would have to carry out both of those with the prospect that they might be fired.
Now, let's be very clear about one thing here. These are plans and not actions. We shouldn't misread this as saying that any of the 2 leaders wanted a war. As we've seen before, both were terrified of the idea. It's just that one action after the other on both sides has now led them down that path, one little step at a time. It's safe to assume that the U.S. president will give a small sigh of relief when he finally receives Khrushchev's offer this evening. That is, once he's spent time reading and deciphering it, because it's long, rambling, and at times not very clear. What is crystal clear is that by now, both of them have long lost their grip on the leash that was supposed to hold back the dogs of war. Tomorrow they will bark and bite as one insane event after the other escalates the crisis to the actual brink of nuclear war. See you then on day 12. If you want to hear more from the diary of the Submariner, Spartacus has recorded it for you, and it's right here. Do not forget to subscribe, and please support us on Patreon so that we can make more awesome history. Good night and good luck.